Hello and welcome to my third video. My name is Alex. I wanted to record an introductory video today about the planets in astrology. So my first two videos were sort of examples of what astrology can do. They were pretty much in-depth examples, and I used advanced techniques and concepts that probably people who have been studying astrology for a period of time do know about. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the basics in astrology and how I see things. Um, and I think one of the most important aspects to start with are the planets. So in astrology, you have four major things that you need to look at if you want to understand how to read an astrological chart, right? So you have the planets and some points. So there are some important points and planets in astrology. So the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Uranus. You also have the ascendant, for example, that is not a planet, it's a point. You have the part of fortune or the north node of the moon. Those are points. They are not really planets, but they're very important for certain techniques and they're very important, especially at certain periods of time. The other the other things are the 12 signs of the zodiac. They don't have anything to do with the constellations. So the constellations used in astronomy to divide the sky in larger portions, mm, they don't have the signs of the zodiac have nothing to do with that. The signs of the zodiac are a sort of a 2D a two-dimensional 30-degree segment of the ecliptic. So it's a 30-degree segment of the path of the sun through the sky. They have nothing to do with constellations. Even though, the sign of Virgo and the constellation of Virgo, they both have the same name. They don't have anything to do with each other. And we also have the houses. We also have 12 houses in the same way that we have 12 signs. I usually use whole sign houses, so I'm not gonna talk about other house systems. I use whole sign houses. So for each sign, we assign one house, and usually we start from the ascendant. And the final part in astrology that you need to understand and you become familiar and comfortable with is the doctrine about aspects, which pretty much just describe planets that have the ability to communicate with each other and what's the nature of that communication, right? So if you have two planets that are 120 degrees apart compared to two planets that are 90 degrees apart, they both have a way to communicate. It's just that a 120-degree angle is much more fortunate and auspicious, and it leads to better results than the 90-degree angle, which is said to be of the nature of Mars, so it's said to be frustrating, for example. So they sort of represent a sort of road between the planets where they can exchange energy or they can exchange things or whatever. Usually, when people talk about astrology in pop culture, they talk about the sun. So they talk about sun sign astrology and they ignore everything else. But probably the most important thing that they should be talking about is the ascendant. So the ascendant in astrology just is the point where the sun rises in the morning. Is very simple. So if you look on the horizon, if you've ever seen the sunrise, the point on the horizon where the sun rises, that's the ascendant. It is it is whatever portion of the sky, whatever, stars were rising from the eastern horizon at the moment of your birth in your natal chart. That is what the ascendant is. It's a very important point. It represents you, it represents your life, your vitality, your body, your health, your personality. So if you look at the sign that the ascendant is in, that sets some parameters for how your personality is going to be like. And to some extent, that is true. Everything else in the chart comes into play. So it's not just about the ascendant, but that is one major part of your identity and who you are in your personality. So in psychological astrology, for example, we use the ascendant a lot to be able to tell what kind of character we're dealing with, what kind of personality we're dealing with. And the ascendant also rules physical and material things that you identify with. So, for example, if you have Venus in the first house very close to the ascendant, so like I said earlier, the ascendant will be used um, for as the starting point for the houses, right? So, whatever sign the ascendant is in, that will be the first house. So, if you have Venus very close to your ascendant, it is very likely that things related to Venus are very close to your identity. So who you think you are, that's very close to what Venus represents. So Venus is about beauty, it is about art, maybe you're an artist or maybe you're a good looking person. So, beauty, for example, can be a huge part of who you think you are. So your personality and your identity will be a lot centered around that. Or maybe you're an artist, maybe you paint, you make very beautiful paintings, or you write beautiful songs, or you sing, and a big part of your identity will be around art or just makeup or anything Venusian. Maybe you just like nature, for example. Venus is about nature. Um, Maybe you just enjoy, good food from time to time that looks beautiful and smells very nice. Anything Venusian that, appeals to the senses, that can be part of your identity. And another very important point is the descendant. So in the chart that I'm using as an example right now, the ascendant, um, denoted with AS, is at 23 degrees of Sagittarius, and the descendant, denoted with DS, is at 23 degrees of Gemini. The descendant just represents the other, right? So I wrote down in my notes, so anybody you are in a one-to-one relationship with. Um, Whatever you're doing, for example, if you go to work every day and you work with one other person on a project, that other person you will represent the descendant in astrology, right? So if you are looking at your natal chart and you want to see what kind of people you come in close contact with, in like one-to-one relationships with, you look at a descendant. It can represent your marriage partner, business partners, or any short-term one-to-one involvement with somebody, right? Even if you go to the grocery store and you have, a 5-minute conversation with somebody who works there, you will be represented symbolically by the ascendant in the astrological chart, and the other person will be represented by the descendant. So your chart, your natal chart applies, but also the chart of those current transits or whatever the ascendant is at the time that you have an interaction with someone, that will also come into play. The other very important point in astrology, and many people are familiar with this one as well, is the midheaven. So in the chart that I'm using as an example, the midheaven is at 28 degrees of Libra in the 11th whole sign house. So this basically represents your reputation, your career, your public life, your professional identity, for example. So if you say, somebody, maybe you're a judge, it is likely people who have Jupiter close to the midheaven, it's likely that they're a judge or a priest or something like that. So your professional identity and what you do in this world is sort of shown by the midheaven, and how you do it, and your work ethic to some extent, and your personality at work, for example, is given by the midheaven. A lot of people have a personality at work that's their polar opposite to their personality that they have at home with their families. Maybe, for example, at home they're more dramatic and more intense, and at work they're more patient, they're slower, they take their time with things. At home, maybe they're more impatient. For example, there will be an interplay between a midheaven ruled by a Venus and an IC ruled, and the opposite point of the midheaven, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that's going to be ruled by Mars. So the midheaven is very much like an ascendant. It shows your personality, but your personality in public and at work, and whenever you set off to achieve something, your personality and how you approach doing those things will be shown by the midheaven. And this is, before I move on to the next point, I wanted to point out that basically everything in the astrological chart, to some extent, it can represent you. I've seen many times, for example, let's say somebody has Saturn on the descendant, right? So the descendant, we said that it represents the other, or your partners, people you come in close one-to-one relationships with. So the descendant is the other. And if you have Saturn close to that, maybe you're avoiding relationships, maybe you're fearful of relationships. So that Saturn close to the descendant will show something about your personality. Or maybe you come into contact with people who are a bit cold, or maybe you are cold and you project that identity onto them. So it's a little bit unclear, you know the descendant, yes, it represents the other, but very often the descendant and whatever personality is described by the descendant, when you come into a one-to-one relationship with somebody, you can take on some of those characteristics as well. Even though most of the time, probably you're going to show characteristics that are in line with your ascendant, right? There are times when you're going to take on characteristics that are related to the descendant. This is why astrology is such a complex and complicated system, and it's really difficult to sort of to easily prove whether it works or not, because many things in the chart just represent a different facet of who you are. So the next point that I wanted to talk about is the IC. So I mentioned earlier, right? So the midheaven is your personality at work. The IC is very much your personality at home with your family in private. So the IC represents your personal life, your family, your personality at home. The personality of your family can be represented by the IC. It also shows your roots, your foundation in life, your home and your living situation, and your private and your interior life. So to some extent, the fourth sign from the ascendant has something to do with your interior life. It's a more spiritual house, but the IC also, it also shows your personality when you're not in public, when you're not, out there. So one thing I didn't mention about the midheaven, um, why is it represented with MC in here? So the midheaven is represented by MC because it stands for medium coeli, which it just means the middle of the sky. So when planets are close to the midheaven, they are at the highest point that they can reach in the sky, right? So the midheaven represents the intersection between the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun. So as the sun moves through the sky, it intersects a line that goes from the south all the way across above your head and back to the north. So that is called, in astronomical terms, I think it's called one of the great circles, and that is called the meridian. And the meridian intersected with the ecliptic, it gives you the MC. That's a technical bit, but the most important and symbolically important thing about the MC is that is the highest point in the sky. When a planet or when the sun is there or the moon is there, they have very high visibility. And the midheaven, symbolically, that's what it represents in the chart as well. It's your public life, your achievements, anything. If you have planets there, they have very high visibility. And it's a very, very important point in life. In astrology, and obviously in your life, is going to be a very meaningful point. And the IC, it's represented by IC because it means imum coeli, which just, I think, it comes from Latin, and imum coeli just means the bottom of the sky. Now, these are the most important points in astrology, and we can move on to talk about the luminaries. So in astrology, very often the luminaries, the sun and the moon, they are often called planets because in astrology, a planet does not have the same definition that it has in astronomy. So a planet in astrology doesn't have to obey the definition that it has in astronomy. So often people would call the luminaries um, planets as well. So let's start with the most popular one of them all, which is the sun. The sun, if we look at it, just outside of the astrological framework, it represents the source of all life. It is the source of all the source of light for us and a source of warmth. Um, it shows in astrology. It also kind of shows the same thing. It is related to your identity, but on a deeper level. So the ascendant shows your personality and things you identify with, but it's a more superficial and a more material level. But the sun, it shows your personality on a slightly deeper level. Astrologers often say that the sun shows where you shine in life. Um, it points at things that you're naturally good at. It points at things that you naturally enjoy to do. So things that you're really enthusiastic about, a lot of cultures have seen the sun as being God because it's very obvious, that for us, plants rely on the sun, on the light of the sun for living. We rely on the warmth and the light of the sun for living. We know it's the source of all light, so it's a very easy association to make between the divinity and the sun. So things that you feel really enthusiastic about and things that you really enjoy to do in life, they will be shown by the sun in your chart. The word enthusiasm, actually, I was listening to a talk by Eckhart Tolle, and he was talking about how the word enthusiasm means, translated literally from Greek, because it comes from Greek, it means in God, because enthusiasm comes from en theos. So en means in, and theos means God. So it does have something to do with divinity. It does show an area in your life where you have a natural intelligence. So you deal with things in an intelligent way, in a very self-aware way. It has something to do with consciousness, I believe, right? So this is quite a deep topic, but everything that you perceive in this world, everything you become aware of, you can see things through, because thanks to the light of the sun. So you can see things, you're aware of things outside of yourself, because you have consciousness. So consciousness, it is associated with the sun quite a bit. It has close religious associations, so the sun often would be associated to some extent also with priests like Jupiter, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. It shows things that make you feel alive and that make you feel full of joy, things that you love to do and you expect nothing really in return for them. So I was listening recently to an interview by Dolly Parton, and she said she has the sun in the fifth whole sign house, very close to Venus, and she said that she loves music and writing songs. And even if she didn't make any money from it, she knows for sure that she would still use whatever money she has to record a CD or something, to do something, because of how much she enjoys singing and writing songs. And this is pretty much this is an amazing example for what the sun represents in astrology, because it does show you those things that you really enjoy to do. You expect nothing in return for, because the joy that you get from it is enough to sort of sustain you. I think that's a pretty good introduction for the sun, so we can move on to the next luminary, which is the moon. So there's not a luminary that's necessarily more important than the other, because none of the chart could really exist without all of these components inside of it. Um, so the second luminary we're talking about is the moon. So the moon in this chart is right here at 27 degrees of Pisces. So the sun is represented by the circle with a dot inside of it. So the glyphs for the planets, they have an interesting meaning behind them, but I'm not going to go into that because it would take far too long, and it's not particularly important. But the glyph for the sun is a circle with a dot inside, and the glyph for the moon, at 27 degrees of Pisces, is very straightforward. It looks like a crescent. Um, So the moon in astrology represents your body, it represents your mind, your reaction to things, your instinct, the instinct of gathering things, collecting things. So people who are collectors or gather things, and hoarders as well, they have usually a really interesting moon in their natal chart. The moon has been described by ancient astrologers also as a wanderer. It shows your emotional responses, your moods, where you feel comfort. I think this is one of the most interesting things that the moon represents, right? It represents the area of your chart where you go when you want to feel comforted and you want to feel good. So I know quite a few people that have the moon in the fifth whole sign house. and they like playing games, for example, to feel good. You know, if the moon is in the ninth whole sign house, maybe you're somebody who really enjoys going to church or visiting foreign countries, things like that. That's what brings you comfort. So the moon represents those things that make you feel comfortable, bring you comfort, and they sort of nurture you on certain level. You know, food, for example, is the most obvious things that your body needs for being nurtured. Is represented by the moon. The moon can show. I've seen it a couple of times that the moon is showing how people eat and what kind of food they enjoy. Um, it shows your ability to nurture other people and to take care of other people. It is often so the sun, I didn't really mention this, sometimes it's associated with the father, and the moon is associated with the mother. The moon has a lot to do with your ability to bring life into this world and to take care of other people, like a child or a plant or anything. To to wash them, to feed them, to keep things clean, to keep them protected in a way. I think the moon can be, to a certain extent, it can be quite a fierce protector. Um, because of that reason, because women bring children into the world, and they bring new life into the world, and usually they take care of children. Um, they're associated more closely with the moon, and then that leaves men for the sun. But that's not necessarily true. I don't think it's always very clear that the sun represents the father in somebody's chart. It can the father or parents very often are well represented by the fourth whole sign house. Other than that, there are arguments pro and against. This is the first planet that we're going to talk about, is going to be Mercury. So in this chart, Mercury is at 3 degrees of Sagittarius, 3 degrees and 38 minutes. So this is the first planet. So if you don't want to count the sun and the moon as planets, Mercury would be the first planet that we're looking at. Mercury just rules all forms of exchange. If it's exchange of words, exchange of information, exchange of money, communication, IT systems, means of transport, um, moving people from A to B, trade, journalism, writing, coming up with words for things. Language is very much a mercurial thing. Um, Mercury is also, I think, it can be quite good at marketing. It can be a trickster. Is the planet, the god that governs words, and words can be quite deceptive. There are many ways in which you can phrase something to sort of give a different meaning, to give a slightly different impression of a thing, and Mercury can be very good at this. Um, Mercury is good at finding associations between things. It is quite a clever planet, so it can show an area of your life where you're clever, not necessarily wise or intelligence, but just clever, like how to how to put things to work things to your advantage. It shows your ability to conceptualize and to speak about things. So whatever Mercury comes into contact with in your natal chart or in transits, Mercury kind of gives a megaphone to that planet. And if it's in an aspect with a good planet, usually you get good news. If it's in an aspect with a bad planet, you get bad news. So, traditionally a good planet would be Venus and Jupiter, a bad planet would be Mars and Saturn. So depending which it comes into contact with, you can get good news or bad news. So Mercury's role is very, very neutral in general in astrology. It shows how people communicate. It shows, your ability to come up with words to describe what you feel, to come up with words to describe different things. So wherever it's in the chart, that's where you have a good ability, to discuss those things. Um, I think that's a pretty good introduction for Mercury. The next one would be Venus. So Venus is at 24 degrees and 23 minutes in Libra. It was very close to the midheaven when I started to record this. Um, it Venus represents the area and the things in your life that you where it shows where you experience pleasure, where you experience harmony. It shows your ability to create beauty, to make friends, to form good relationships, to form romantic relationships, to create peace and understanding between people or between different things. Your sense of beauty and harmony, if you want to decorate a room, if you have a strong Venus, that would be quite helpful. If your Venus is not so strong, you might not do a very good job. If Venus is not in a good sign, that is um, helpful for, you know, dealing with physical things, you might not be good at decorating things. So if Venus is in Gemini, for example, maybe you are good at coming up with beautiful words, at putting words together in a beautiful way, but maybe you're not so good at, decorating a room. Maybe Venus in Cancer would help with home decor, or Venus in Taurus, because they have Venus in Taurus is very strong. It has a very strong sense of beauty in there. It shows your artistic ability in general, things which bring you pleasure, what you find beautiful, um, also things that people find beautiful inside of you. So it's things that you find beautiful and things that people appreciate about you as well. It is a very patient planet. It shows leisure, doing things in a relaxed way. It has to do with diplomacy. It shows your network of people, how strong of a network you have, and your ability to network with others, to create relationships again. So it's a lot about relationships. It can show what kind of people you have good relationships with, because it shows the things you enjoy and the people you enjoy. It's a deeper kind of joy and enjoyment. It's not a deeper kind of enjoyment than what the sun brings. So the sun would probably bring the most genuine and authentic experience of joy and happiness, and the Venus can bring pleasure and joy, but on a much less powerful level. It's more superficial, and it does not show who you are on the same deep level that the sun does. Other things that it shows, I wrote here an idiom, an English idiom. So beauty is only skin deep. That very much applies to Venus, right? So it does show an ability to beautify things, to put things in a nice way in your room, or to come up with beautiful words, but it's not deeply meaningful necessarily. Comedians, for example, can have strongly placed Venus, maybe Mercury and Venus are in a good relationship, so they come up with words in such a way that it brings other people pleasure, happiness. You know, again, happiness may be a bit superficial, but it is shown by Venus. Your ability to just go out and enjoy a party has to do with Venus. So Venus is the first planet that we consider to be a benefic, or an auspicious, a good planet. It brings good things usually. And I think Venus is the first planet where it makes sense to talk about sect. So we usually look at charts that, if you're born during the day, if the sun is above the horizon when you're born, we say that you have a day chart. If the sun is below the horizon, we say that you have a night chart. And if you have a day chart, Venus is said to not be as strong. But if you have a night chart, Venus is a much stronger benefic planet. So depending on this distinction between a day and a night chart, so if you're born with the sun above the horizon or below the horizon, Venus can vary in strength. And the next planet that we're going to talk about is Mars. So Mars is kind of a pair, the opposite polarity of Venus. So it shows your ability to fight, to be assertive, to lead things, your ability to manage people, boss people around, to tell them what to do. It shows your ambition, your drive, your willpower, your strength, your endurance, your ability to spring into action, for example, to solve a problem, your athletic ability, your competitiveness, your ability to deal with conflict and confrontation. It is about strife, being aggressive, martial arts, fighting, debating, arguing, different sports. Stealing and lying kind of comes with Mars. So especially if Mars and Mercury are together, this is a really well established thing in astrology that I think everybody agrees with. Mercury and Mars together usually make people that, lie or steal or commit forgery. Mars has to do with crimes and more difficult things. Um, we said that Venus is about being patient, taking things in a slow and relaxed way. Mars wants things to move fast. It's really impatient. It has to do with killing, beating, torturing. There's some ugly aspects of it. It has to do with defending yourself. So offensive is one side of Mars, but also defense is also another side of Mars. So if you defend yourself a lot, that also comes across as a Mars related things, as a Mars related thing. That's why people tend to not like planets like Mars and Saturn. So Mars is the first planet that is slightly negative, and we can talk about, a bad planet or a malefic, we call it. And Venus, for example, is a benefic. Mars is the first malefic planet that we talk about. um, if you're very defensive, people tend to not like that. People don't really like things coming from malefic planets, even though sometimes they're necessary and obviously they're part of life, but people prefer not to think about them and they don't really like them for whatever reason. So, um, I wrote down in my notes also that Mars deals with heated situations. It represents heated situations, heated discussions, your ability to engineer a solution, forging or um, making a tool in a certain shape by heating it up in fire, for example. That's a very Martian thing, so the way that you make a sword, the process of making it is all Mars related. So knives, guns, swords, those are all in the world of Mars. It also shows your ability to end a relationship, your ability, to throw things away, to sever ties with people, injuries, carelessness, um, vulgar speech and behavior is associated with Mars. So yeah, that's about it. So it is a malefic planet, and you can see when I was mentioning the ability to end a relationship, or to argue a point of view, for example, you can see those things are necessary. So we cannot say that Mars is all bad, but usually it's a more unpleasant experience to defend yourself or to debate someone or to argue with someone or to end a relationship, even though it's necessary. It's not a pleasant thing. So it's a pretty unpleasant and difficult thing to deal with. So I forgot to show where Mars is in here. So Mars is very strong at the moment. It's in Scorpio, at 28 degrees of Scorpio, and pretty close to Mercury. But they're in different signs, so they don't interact very much. We're going to talk about that at a later point. So the next planet that I wanted to talk about is Jupiter. Jupiter is also very strong in this chart. It's at 25 degrees of Cancer in the eighth whole sign house. Um, it's kind of looks like a four. So does Jupiter what does Jupiter represent in astrology? So it shows where you experience generosity, where you experience benevolence, where you find meaning in life. It shows your ability to grow and expand things. So it shows abundance, wealth, mystical and spiritual experiences to some extent are related to Jupiter. Being a priest, being a judge, being a wise man, or just being a wise person, a wise man in the sense of dealing with sometimes magic and astrology and the occult. To some extent, they have to do with Jupiter because you try to find expansion and you try to it's usually things that you're trying to use to improve your life that have a spiritual undertone to them, so those have to do with Jupiter. um it shows where you have the ability to be a sort of guru or a teacher. So in Vedic astrology, Jupiter is called the guru. it has a lot to do with astrology. So, for example, I was reading in a book on Vedic astrology that they believe that every time a class on astrology starts, Jupiter should be on the ascendant. It has a strong link to astrology and to things that are esoteric and spiritual to some extent. One thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking about Mars, so in the same way that for Venus, we said that during the day it's not as strong, but at night it's a very strong planet. Like in a also at night, but also if you have a night chart, so if the sun is below the horizon, Venus tends to be stronger. In the same way, Mars, because it is a malefic planet, it's a difficult influence, it's a difficult planet. During the day, it can be much more difficult. So if you have Mars in a day chart, Mars can be quite difficult. But if you have Mars in a night chart, it can be a little bit more constructive and helpful. So now that we talk about Jupiter, in the same way that Mars is very problematic, more problematic during the day than during the night, Jupiter is much more helpful if you have a day chart than if you have a night chart. So if the sun is above the horizon, whatever Jupiter is going to show, all those significations of wealth and abundance, it also shows, royalty and noblemen, people who are born in a lot of privilege. Um, you know, it can show those things, but maybe for you in your chart shows something else. Whatever area it is in is going to be a much more benefic influence than if you have a night chart. And I've seen that in a couple of charts actually, and it's a very interesting influence because I do have two friends who have very similar charts. They both have Jupiter in Cancer in the second whole sign house. So we're going to talk about houses and signs later, but Jupiter is very strong in Cancer. We say that that Jupiter is exalted there. And in the second whole sign house, it means that Jupiter operates in an area of your life that has to do with finances and money and valuables and belongings and your property and all of those things. And Jupiter, since it signifies wealth and abundance and generosity and benevolence and blessings and good spirit, good things in general, auspiciousness, luck. um, you'd think that Jupiter would bring a lot of luck by being in the second house in Cancer. And in one instance, for somebody who has a day chart, so somebody born during the day with the sun above the horizon, Jupiter did bring all of those things to a more extreme than in the other chart. So the person who's born during the night is having a good time with finances, but nowhere near, it does not experience the same level of abundance as the person who has Jupiter in Cancer in the day chart in the second whole sign house. So um, depending on whether or not you have a day or night chart, that can make a pretty big difference for these planets, right? The benefic planets such as Jupiter and Venus, and the malefic Mars, and later we're going to talk about Saturn. Um, Jupiter also shows, beside everything that we mentioned, it also shows, like I said, people who are born with a lot of privilege, royalty, and things that you believe in, things that you have faith in, things that you find meaningful. If you want to create a belief system, a spiritual practice, if you want to create, a religion and you're going to be in charge of it, that is a Jupiterian thing. Jupiter has to do with judges, with philosophers, but philosophers in the sense that Pythagoras was a philosopher, right? So in the sense of teaching people how to live and giving them advice. So a Jupiterian person is somebody that you go to because you know that they're quite wise and they know what the right thing to do is. And in the same way, a philosopher or somebody who has a good philosophy of life and is admired and is quite wise, they would know to give you good advice. This is where the guru significance comes in, right? So they would give you good advice and um, help you out in life quite a bit. I think these are all the significations for Jupiter. So we can move on to the next planet. So the next one is Saturn. So Saturn in this chart actually is at 25 degrees in Pisces, 25 degrees and 43 minutes. The red R shows that it is retrograde. Um, So what does Saturn represent? Saturn represents limitations. It represents boundaries, delays. It is a very slow and grinding influence. It can feel oppressive, limiting. It contracts, so it is kind of the opposite of Jupiter, right? So Jupiter expands and wants more and gives abundance, um, and wealth, and Saturn usually would give a native that has the opposite of all that. So they may believe in they have, they live in scarcity. They have less to they have to make do with a lot less than Jupiterian people. Saturn shows your contracts and your commitments in life, your ability to commit. So if you have very strong Saturn, you might have a good ability to commit and to honor your contracts. Discipline is ruled by Saturn. So if Saturn is strong in your chart, you probably have good discipline. If Saturn is strong in your chart, you probably have very high standards certain in a certain area. So if Saturn is in your 10th whole sign house, very close to the midheaven, it is likely that you have a high standard when it comes to the work that you do. So you wouldn't put out work out there that is not like properly well researched. Or if Saturn is in the 11th house, it can be very critical of friends or groups of people. Saturn has a tendency to be very critical, and that's where the high standards are coming from. It can point out flaws, it sees flaws and the weak points in things. It favors older people and older structures. Um, it is Saturn, it has to do with Chronos. It is kind of the god that rules time. It gives an expiration date to everything. When things come to an end, when death comes around, very often, we think of Saturn. Saturn wants to build things that endure in life. So that is its nature. It wants to build things that last a very long time. It favors old people and is also very tough on young people. Obviously, those two kind of come together. Um, and it is a known fact, for example, that older people have an easier time with commitments and with discipline than younger people. And older people have, maybe um, they do things in a better way. Their work quality would be better. Um, they've put in, enough work and enough time has passed so they can tell the difference between something that is good quality and something that is not very good quality. People born under a strong Saturn can sometimes be a bit pessimistic. They have like a realism that can be slightly pessimistic. They can feel oppressed. Depression often is associated with Saturn, a sort of a misery, living, um, you know, um, being sort of sad, uh, miserable, depressed. Under a Saturn transit, we've all experienced being a little bit down, maybe sometimes completely, unable to do things. This is pretty much what Saturn brings. So while Jupiter would show you where you find meaning in life and what things you find meaningful, and when you have a good Jupiter transit, you're gonna find meaning in a new area of life. It'll be exciting and it'll bring expansion and good things. When Saturn comes in transit, it'll make you feel like everything is meaningless. You'll probably wonder what's the point in anything, things that come with regular depression. So, as I said earlier, Jupiter has a very strong tendency to affirm things. So we can say yes to things. So if you have an area of your life where you're quite blocked to some extent, when Jupiter goes through there, things just start going the way you want them to. If you wanted, for example, a raise, if you wanted more money at work, but that hasn't happened for years, when Jupiter comes in conjunction with a planet that rules money for you, it is very likely that that is a strong indicator. But you need more than one indicator for things to come true. But it is a strong indicator that things will finally start to increase and go in the direction that you want them to. Um, and with Saturn is kind of the opposite. So Saturn just causes delays and it says no. It is very famously, um, saying no to things is very famous for negating things. It has to do with being an ascetic or a renunciate. So this is a spiritual thing that is more popular probably in countries such as India. Um, these are people who tend to be quite spiritual and they sacrifice all physical and material pleasures and they live in isolation sometimes. So, living in isolation has to do with Saturn. That is the nature of Saturn. Saturn is hardworking, does not like to party, does not like to enjoy things, wants to work hard and be left alone. There's like a grumpy old man that wants to do his thing and be left alone. Um, Yeah, so it just in general it brings misfortune and some sort of accident. So, like I said earlier, Mars is the first malefic planet that we talked about. It is very problematic in a day chart, less problematic in a night chart. Saturn is less problematic in a day chart, but it can be quite problematic in a night chart. So, if you're born during the night, Saturn is something to look at for finding, you know, a life area where you encounter a lot of difficulties. I think I'm gonna split this video in a two-part series. So this will be the end of the first part. So we talked about the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, and the IC. Um, those are called the angles in astrology. They're very important points. There's a lot of energy there. They're very high energy points. They render whatever planet they're touching very active and very prominent in the chart. So they're very important to look at. And even, you know, by being close to a planet, they give it a lot of energy, but also by aspect. We said earlier, and we're going to talk in a separate video probably about aspects, but if there's a favorable angle between the midheaven and another planet, you will get a lot of energy from the midheaven, and it'll render that planet very active and very useful in a way. And we talked about the seven traditional planets, or the two luminaries and the five visible planets so far. And for the second part of this video, I'm going to talk about some extra points um, and the outer planets. So I'm going to talk about Uranus and Neptune as the outer planets. We're going to talk about Pluto, which is called the dwarf planet, but it is a body in astrology that is quite different to a regular planet. It's a very slow moving body. We're going to talk about it when time comes. There are two other very important points in astrology, the north node of the moon and the south node of the moon. So in Vedic astrology, the north node is Rahu and the south node is called Ketu. Vedic astrologers deal with it much more than Western or modern astrologers do, maybe. And they have very good um, interpretations for what those points mean. So those are not planets with their important points like the ascendant and the descendant. They are the intersection between the ecliptic and the orbit of the path of the moon. Um, so the path of the moon, it intersects the path of the sun in 2 points, and those are the north and the south node of the moon. And I'm going to talk about some other points that I use. So I also look at the black moon Lilith in astrology. When I look at a chart, I look at Chiron, which very often is ignored and rejected by astrologers or traditional astrologers especially. Um, and I think that's about it. And I'll probably talk a bit about the part of fortune and the part of spirit, or the lot of fortune, lot of spirit, and the lot of eros. So I do look at where those are in the chart. I don't necessarily interpret them, but they're very useful to know, and they're used in certain techniques for predictions. But the part of fortune or the lot of fortune is very important because it can be considered um, as another ascendant. So, like I said earlier, so the ascendant in astrology, the AS, that will give you the first house, right? But there are other points that you can use as the first house. So wherever the sun is, right? The sun can be considered the first house. You can do houses from the sun. Wherever the moon is, you can consider that to be the first house, and you can do houses from the moon, and so on. Maybe not so on, because that's pretty much it. And the lot of fortune would also show you another starting point where you can do houses from. But more often than not, you just use houses from the ascendant. That's more than enough to be able to predict things. It becomes really complicated to do houses from other points. So 99% of the time, we just look at houses from the ascendant. But, you know, if you do have if you do have, you know, important transits that are opposite your sun, for example, I would probably think that, you know, those have to do with relationship dynamics, because the sun will show your identity to some extent and will show who you are. And whatever is in the opposite house, in the opposite sign, you know, that will be like a descendant. So it is relevant, and it's important to know what kind of people you encounter. Um, but yeah, it becomes a very complex system, but it's very beautiful when you put everything together. I think that's it for the first part of the video, and I'll see you in the next one.